Many times we buy a piece of software, it's not going to work until we register it. Our car's registered, our children are registered, all kinds of things we're registered. This word, we're letting somebody know that we exist or something when we register to vote. What does it mean in legal terms? It's a very specific meaning. When you register something, you are giving away whatever you are registering to whoever you're registering it with. Let that sink in because it's really profound. Register means you are giving away whatever you are registering to whoever you're registering it with. So you buy a piece of software, it doesn't work until you register it. So you register it, which means you're giving it away. And they're saying, okay, well, you can have it back with a magic secret code, but only under our terms and conditions of use. What we'll do is we'll grant you a license. And if you're in breach of that license, then there's consequences for that. It sounds bizarre, isn't it? You buy something, you think, well, that's mine, I'll buy that, that's mine, that's fine. No, in order to read it, you've got to give it back, but I've already paid for it. And when you read it, there are terms and conditions applied to how you read it, and maybe what information you divulge from what you've read. So you can see it's a way of tying you up. But let's go on a bit further. Let's look at this word application. It's one of those things we do a lot. To get a job. Application. 17th century translation to that. As it is today, application means you are a beggar. And it's presumed you know what you're giving up in order to get what you're begging for. Submit. It's not like, oh, I'll submit this to you. Submit means you bend to another's will. So if you submit an application to register, what you've done in terms of legal is you've given up all your rights voluntarily. Because remember, there's laws against slavery, but there isn't any law against voluntary slavery. We've been deceived, and it is a deception. It's an immaculate deception, really, when you start getting to the bottom of it. But let's go to the next bottom line here. What else do you register? Well, you register your birth, don't you? Your birth is registered, and you get a certificate. And if you look at that certificate, and it's an incredible document, really, when you start reading it with legal eyes, you just think, oh, it's got the mother's name in it. It hasn't got the mother's name. It says informant. And on the back of it, remember, it's got the Crown Corporation logo on it. By the way, the Crown is a corporation, it's not the Queen. On the back of it, it says, this is not proof of identity. Well, you think how many documents are derived from that birth certificate? Your driving license, your passport, your NHS thing, all of it comes from it. So if it's not proof of identification, what does it mean legally? So you're kind of left with this conundrum. Well, I've registered my birth, I've got this bond back. Bond is an abbreviated word. Where do you think the word bond comes from? It's really obvious. It comes from bondage. You've been registered. When you register something, you give something away. You've been given into bondage to the Crown Corporation. This is legally what it means. If you're given into bondage to the Crown Corporation, and we can prove it because there's a certificate that says that's the case, what does that mean? What's the bottom line here? Well, I'll go back to a little bit of history now. I haven't got anything behind me, but those of you who used to play Monopoly probably can remember that a pound sign used to kind of be like this, and it had two lines through it. Remember that? And the dollar sign had kind of like this S, and it had two lines through it. So it had two lines through it. Now, the pound used to be called sterling. It was called sterling for a reason, and it was based on silver. And of course, in America, the dollar had the same two lines through it, and it was all the silver dollar. That's what it was. But in 1929, the banks owned everything. They owned absolutely everything because of a thing called the Wall Street crash, which they brought about into existence. And then they also changed things. They changed the pound sign, so it had one line through it, and the dollar sign, so it had one line. So they removed one line. Well, if the banks owned everything, the money in circulation then has a different value. There's something else backing it. If silver isn't backing it anymore, what is backing it? And around about the same time in 1933, a guy called Colonel House, who worked for the Rothschilds banking cartel, among other people, came up with this idea of registration. And he's quoted as saying, not 1 in a million people will work this out. Because they had to, if the banks own everything, then the country's bankrupt. They have to find a way of carrying on business and commerce, don't they? So they need something else that's backing that currency. The way that it works, and I'll give you a process, because I'm a shrink as well, but I'll give you a process. We deal with things in terms of process, because you can get lost in content, which is the detail of things. So if I would say, for example, a dairy farmer. I'm a dairy farmer, and the bank says, sorry, Alan, we've got you all the money we can, we're going to foreclose on you, you're bankrupt. But good news is we'll keep you on as a manager, seeing as you know a bit about what you're doing. So we now own your farm, and you now work for us. But what we'll do is for every calf that's born, we'll extend you credit based on the milk and cheese and meat that it's going to produce in its lifetime. You register that calf with us, and we'll extend you credit based on the milk and cheese and meat it's going to produce in its lifetime. Well, you are the cattle. You are those calves, because when your births were registered, money, it's called a fiat currency, is put into circulation, and it's based on the wealth that you can create in your lifetime, your labour. That's basically what it is. But I tend to look at that term as your sweat equity. So that's what backs currency. It's a promissory note. A promissory note is a negotiable instrument. Banks deal in negotiable instruments. It gets worse, believe you me, it gets worse. And I'm probably going a little bit too far, but I guess the point of this talk is to hopefully stimulate you guys to do your own research. So if I can throw enough stuff at you and go, well, that guy said can't be true, it can't possibly be true. I'd say, I'll welcome you. Do your own research and find this out for yourself, because the more people that know this, how we're caught in this situation, the more people that have the knowledge about it, the easier it will be for us to get out of this trap. It does get worse. It gets much worse, actually, when you look at it. For example, there's a thing that goes along with the birth certificate. A bond is created, obviously, a contract, and that's worth money. The original title of this talk was going to be The Occult Significance of Law, because most people don't think there is anything occult about law at all. And those that would do any research would go, oh, that's absolute rubbish, Alan, that can't possibly be that. I'll totally reject that. And by rejecting it, lose the opportunity to begin to comprehend what's really going on. Because there is a very strong occult aspect to law. And the reason they dress the way they do, and the terminology and the language that they use as well. In fact, it's very much an occult art. It is, in fact, the occult art of law. To be a member of the Bar Association goes back to Venice, the Venetians, which isn't a million miles away phonetically from the Phoenicians, who were kind of a race of pirates around the Mediterranean as well. And we have our laws are broken down into different forms of laws, and one of them is called the law of the sea, and one of them in the British Empire was known as Admiralty law as well. So it's very much the law of the sea. The law of business, the law of commerce, the law of money, the law of trading. Trading in slaves, trading in bails and bonds and surety. In fact, the word courtio, which is where we derive the word court from, in Roman times means to deal in bonds and surety. If you wanted justice, you'd go to the Basilica. That's where you would get justice, not a court. Court just deals in bails and bonds. The bench is a place, if I'm a king and I own a marketplace, I've got my guys who are on my firm there, they've got a bench and they settle the disputes in the marketplace, in the bonds and the sureties, what goes on there. If someone's sold something, it's been underway, then my guys come in and they decide what to do. And if you want to trade in that marketplace, you sign a contract. You have to be allowed, you get a license to trade. Remember I say you register, something's given to you, it's taken back to you, there are now terms and conditions. If you want to trade, you have to register your business. You have to give it all away, and it all comes under one heading, one big pyramid under the top of it, the Crown Corporation. They own it all the businesses, the whole thing, they own it all, it's registered to them, they decide what goes on. They own the money that you have. You think, this is my money in my pocket. It isn't, it's a promissory note. And your tax, some of the tax you pay is the rent for using that. It's theirs, they own it all. It makes sense when it's explained like this. People say, I'm going to pay tax, I'm going to keep this. Well, it's rent for their money. They own you. And the occult aspect of it is that they own your mind, your body, and believe it or not, they believe, these guys are completely off their dials, your soul. This is why they have all the gold, because gold is an immortal metal. This is why they like the precious, they like all that gold. That's why they hold it all, and that's why they circulate money. They now own everything. They have you in bondage. It's a slave-based society, and it's a voluntary slave-based society. You've volunteered. You've entered into a contract. So when you go, for example, it even gets worse. You're part of a, believe it or not, a death cult. The three forms of law, the first is the Uniform Commercial Code. The second is canon law, the Holy See. And the highest form of law, believe it or not, in this country is Talmudic law. Babylonian Talmudic law.
Talmud.
Okay, so the first form of law deals in bonds and surety and you as a slave. And as you're owned, they can do exactly what they like to you, and that's exactly what they do. They extend the credit based on the milk and cheese. All right, so you register to vote. I'm just outlining stuff here to hopefully stimulate your own research. You register to vote means you're giving away whatever you're registering to whoever you're registering it with. So what's the process here? Let's just look at the difference. What happens when you vote? You go in there and they give you a bunch of guys you can vote from, and they say to you, you've got to put an X on the box, don't they? And you follow that and you put an X on the box. Only incompetents or illiterate people sign with an X. And what you do when you register to vote, you say, I'm giving up my responsibility. I'm illiterate, and I agree, I'm a mental health outpatient, and I'll prove this by marking an X on this. And what I do, I will give whoever I put that X against power of attorney. You're giving them power of attorney over your life. In other words, if you were some old guy in a mental hospital who's lost his marbles and the lawyer says he can't manage his affairs anymore, we've got to give someone power of attorney to manage all his finance, to do everything for him. And they get him to sign, and now you've given power of attorney, that person manages your life. So not only do they own you, mind, body and soul, you've now voluntarily registered and giving them power of attorney over your life. So you basically say to them, I'm a mental health outpatient, which is why you vote in a ward, because it's a giant mental asylum. You're in a ward. If you prove to them that you're an illiterate, you put the X on there, and you registered to vote, you've given away your rights, and now you've given them power of attorney. In other words, you say to them, I've let you decide what you think is best for me. If we want a war, that's fine. I've got no say in it. And what they will do is, like, should we say, the deranged young son who's managing, has got power of attorney over his great-grandmother, spending all the money on drugs and resources like that. He'll tell her what she wants to hear. What do these politicians do? They'll tell you what you want to hear. That's the way they're playing the game. Above a mental health outpatient, which you proved yourself to be in their game, is the House of Commons. They're commoners. So you're less than a commoner. People come to me and they say, oh, about the Mac, how many times we buy people